They told her he was pathetic. Walt can just sit on that boat by himself, sweetheart. He's not exactly using it for anything but being sad. It's honestly a little pathetic if I'm being kind. The ice maker in the freezer dropped a fresh batch of cubes into its bin, and the sound of it was the loudest thing in the kitchen for a full 4 seconds. Nobody moved. My daughter's fork stayed suspended an inch above her plate, a piece of salmon still speared on the end of it, going cold. Diane Kessler didn't lower her voice when she said it, because she didn't know I was standing in the doorway with a casserole dish in my hands. And people who don't lower their voices are usually people who've never once imagined getting caught. I stood there and let the words land the way you let a wave hit you when you're too far out to dodge it. Pathetic. Like an old dock line nobody bothers to replace until the day it finally snaps and takes a finger with it. Welcome back to Quiet Reckoning, where the storms take their time but they always arrive. If you're new here, I tell true stories about families, the wounds we carry for each other, and the moments when patience finally runs out. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when it does. My name is Walt Bishop. I'm 63 years old, a retired marine surveyor out of Annapolis, Maryland, which means for 33 years, I climbed into the bilges of other people's boats and told them the truth about what they were worth, whether they wanted to hear it or not. I've certified over 4,000 vessels in my career. I've been married once, for 31 years, to a woman named Eleanor, who everybody called Ellie, and who I lost 2 years ago to ovarian cancer at the age of 60. I know how to look at something worn down to the frame and tell you exactly what's still sound underneath. What I don't do, what I have never once done in 63 years, is let somebody walk off with something that belongs to me and smile about it on the way out the door. I raised one daughter, Claire, 29 years old, and I put $140,000 toward her marine biology degree without her ever knowing the exact number, because Ellie always said you don't hand a kid the price tag of your love, you just pay it. I drove 6 hours round trip every single Sunday for the 11 months Ellie was sick, so Claire wouldn't have to see her mother's decline alone in a hospital room. Those are the only numbers I'll give you, because grief doesn't need a spreadsheet, and neither does love. What matters is I know what I've given, and I know what I'm owed, and until that Tuesday evening in Diane Kessler's over-decorated kitchen, I had never once had to think about the difference. Here's the part I haven't told you yet, and it matters, so stay with me. 3 weeks before that dinner, I'd gone down to the marina on a gray Saturday morning to check on Ellie's Grace, the 44-foot Downis cruiser we'd bought together 9 years earlier, and that I'd spent the last 2 years quietly restoring, teak by teak, in the evenings after work because it kept my hands busy and my mind somewhere other than an empty house. I climbed aboard, stepped up into the cockpit, and reached for the ignition key the way I'd done 10,000 times in my life. My hand wouldn't do it. It just hovered there, shaking, and I sat down hard on the bench seat and stared at the water until a heron landed on the piling next to me and stared right back, patient as a priest. I hadn't taken her out alone since Ellie died, not once. I told people I was busy. I told myself I was busy. The truth is I was afraid of the silence where her voice used to be, calling out headings from the bow. I want you to know that about me before anything else happens in this story, because everything that came after, every quiet, deliberate thing I did, came from a man who couldn't even start his own engine most mornings. I wasn't a hero in this. I was a man trying to remember how to be whole. The trip Diane was talking about that night wasn't Ellie's Grace, though. It was something bigger, something that had been on the calendar since January, and something I hadn't told Claire the full truth about, because some things are easier to let people assume. Back in 1994, a Navy buddy of mine named Frank Nash and I used to talk on late watches about what we'd do when we got out, and Frank's answer was always the same: a boat, not a job on a boat that was his. 22 years later, when Frank finally scraped together enough to start a small operation out of Boston, running 2-week coastal cruises up through the Maritimes on a refitted expedition yacht he called the Meridian Star, he came to me and Ellie first. Before the bank, before anybody, we put in $18,000 of our savings as founding investors, back when $18,000 was closer to everything we had than either of us liked to admit. Frank couldn't pay us back in cash for years, so instead he did something better. He put our names on the vessel's documentation as minority owners of record, the way small operations sometimes do when the money comes from people instead of banks. And every single September since, whichever one of us wanted it got the owner's suite on the Meridian Star for the full 2-week run, free of charge, for the rest of our lives. Ellie sailed it with me 11 times. The 12th time was supposed to be this September, departing Boston on the 14th, and I had already told Claire months earlier exactly what it meant to me. I intended to walk back into that suite alone, spread Ellie's ashes off Grand Manan Island, where she'd once told me the fog looked like something out of a dream, and finally take my own boat out again the following spring, because I'd have proven to myself I still could. That was the goal. That was the whole of it. Not a vacation. A door I needed to walk through by myself before I could walk through any other one. I never told Diane any of that. I'm not sure I'd told Claire all of it either, not the ashes part. But Claire knew the trip mattered more than any trip I'd ever taken, and she'd helped me pick out the little watercolor set I was bringing along because Ellie used to sketch the coastline from the rail, and Claire thought I might try it too, badly, in her honor. So you'll understand why, 3 weeks later, standing in that doorway with a casserole dish going cold in my hands, hearing Diane Kessler call me pathetic for planning to take that trip alone, something in my chest went very, very quiet. Not angry quiet, the other kind. The kind Ellie used to say scared her more than shouting because it meant I was finished reacting and had started deciding. Nobody in that kitchen had noticed me yet except Claire, whose eyes had gone wide and glassy in that particular way that meant she was doing math she didn't want to do out loud. I set the casserole down on the counter, said something forgettable about traffic on Route 50, and let the evening continue as though I hadn't heard a word. That was mistake enough for one night. I wasn't going to compound it by making a scene in front of Diane's imported Italian tile. The actual call came 4 days later on a Wednesday morning, while I was at my kitchen table in the house on Spa Creek Road, same table where Ellie and I had eaten 10,000 breakfasts. Drinking the same brand of coffee I'd been buying since 1998, my phone buzzed. Claire. Hey, sweetheart. Hi, Dad. A pause with weight in it. I'd learned to recognize those pauses over 29 years of parenting her. I need to talk to you about the Meridian trip. I set my mug down carefully. Okay, so Diane and Richard, they're renewing their vows in October 25th anniversary. Well, it's complicated. They got divorced, and now they're back together and doing this whole ceremony thing, and Richard really wants to do something big for it. And Diane mentioned that your trip, the September one, is basically just you going alone. And I told her that, and she asked if maybe, since it's just you, if they could take the suite this year instead, and Richard would pay you back for whatever it's worth. And I know it sounds... Dad, are you there? I counted to 4 before I answered. Ellie used to make me do that before responding to news I didn't like. Claire, that trip isn't a hotel reservation I can hand off. I'm listed on the ownership documents of that vessel. Frank set it up that way in 1994. Silence on the other end. Real silence, the kind that means somebody's discovering a piece of information they should have had a long time ago and didn't ask for because it was easier not to. What do you mean ownership documents? I mean your mother and I are founding investors in that company, Claire. I'm not renting a room. I'm one of the people who owns the boat. I let that sit for a second. Why does Diane need my suite specifically? There are other cruise lines. She said Meridian is the one with the good reviews, the small ship one, and Richard already told his business partners they're going. It's tied into some deal he's trying to close. And Dad, I told her I'd ask. I didn't say yes. Did you give her anything? A booking number, the ship's name, anything? The pause this time told me everything before she said a word. I might have mentioned the name of the company and the departure date. I didn't think it would matter. I thought it was just a scheduling thing. I looked out the kitchen window at the gray October sky, doing what gray October skies in Maryland do, and I told my daughter I loved her, and I told her I needed to go. and I hung up before either of us could say something we'd have to apologize for later. Then I sat at that table for a long time with my coffee going cold, the same table, the same window, the same particular quiet that had been sitting in this house for 2 years now, and I thought about a small brass plaque bolted to the companionway bulkhead down in Frank's shipyard office, engraved with two sets of initials the day the Meridian Star was launched, WB and EB. I hadn't looked at that plaque in 3 years. I decided, sitting there, that I was going to go see it again very soon. The next call came the following morning, and I didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the other end was warm, bright, and entirely too confident for 8:15 on a Thursday. Walt, it's Diane. I just wanted to call and say thank you, genuinely, for being so understanding about the trip. Claire mentioned you were completely fine handing things over, and honestly it means so much to Richard and me, especially with everything we've been through getting back together. I set my coffee cup down very carefully, the way you set something down when you don't trust your hand not to do something else with it. I'm sorry, I said. Handing what over? Exactly? A pause, shorter than Claire's, but just as heavy. The suite. On the Meridian for September. Claire said you weren't really planning to use it for anything special this year, just a solo trip. So it seemed like such an easy thing to let us have it, given the anniversary and everything. I already called the reservations office and had them switch the booking name over. They were so helpful once I explained the family connection. Every hair on my arm stood up at once. She'd called the reservations office. She'd claimed a family connection she had no legal standing to claim on a vessel where my name, not hers, not Claire's, was the one printed on the federal documentation. Diane, I said, and I kept my voice level, the flat kind. The kind Ellie used to say frightened her more than shouting because it meant I was already 3 steps past being angry and standing somewhere colder. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding, and I think you're about to find out how significant very soon. I hung up. Then I sat there with the phone in my hand for a solid minute, looking at the reflection of the window in the dark screen. And I thought about the drawer in my study where I kept a manila folder Ellie had labeled, in her own handwriting, back in 1994, Frank's boat, Keep Forever. I hadn't opened it in years. I got up, walked down the hall, and opened it now. I want to tell you what was in there before I go any further, because it matters more than anything Diane Kessler ever said to me in that kitchen. It wasn't just paperwork. Tucked behind the original share certificate was a single folded page in Ellie's handwriting, dated the same month, a letter she'd apparently never given me, addressed to nobody in particular, more of a private worry set down on paper the way she used to do when something weighed on her. I unfolded it standing right there in the hallway. It wasn't long. A few lines about hoping this boat stayed something we shared out of love and never became something people fought over or felt entitled to just because they were close to us. She'd written, near the bottom, "Don't ever let anyone confuse being family with owning something." And then, underneath that, in different ink, added years later based on the color, she'd written one more line. Especially the ones who only show up when there's something worth taking. I stood in that hallway for a long time. I didn't know it yet, but I was holding the first piece of something that was going to matter a great deal more before this was over. I folded the letter back along its original creases, slid it into my shirt pocket, and picked up the phone to call Frank Nash. It was time somebody at that marina remembered exactly whose name was on the wall. The number was still saved in my phone under Frank N. Meridian, even though I hadn't dialed it in over a year. He picked up on the third ring, and I could hear gulls in the background, which meant he was standing on the Boston dock the way he always was at that hour. Coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other, running his operation the same careful way he'd run a watch section 30 years earlier. "Walt Bishop," he said, "this is either very good news or you're calling about your suite." "Both, maybe," I said. "Frank, did somebody call your reservations office this week, claiming a family connection to my booking?" There was a pause, and then the particular kind of silence that meant a man was pulling up a screen and reading something he didn't like. "A woman named Diane Kessler called Tuesday. Said she was your daughter's future mother-in-law. Said the family had discussed it. and you'd agreed to let her and her fiancé take the September slot as an anniversary gift. She had the departure date, the vessel name, even referenced you by name as the current suite holder. Sandra at the desk processed it as a courtesy transfer because the caller sounded. Sandra's words, like she'd done this 100 times. I never agreed to anything, Frank. I didn't even know about the call until she thanked me for it afterward. Another pause, longer this time. When Frank spoke again, his voice had dropped into the register I remembered from 22 years of knowing him, the one he used when something needed to be fixed and he was already 3 steps into fixing it. Walt, you know as well as I do that suite transfer only holds if the owner of record authorizes it in writing. Sandra's knew she didn't know to ask for that from a family member instead of the actual documented owner. This is on us. Give me 20 minutes. Take your time, I said. I've got nowhere I need to be except a marina in Annapolis, checking on a boat I haven't had the nerve to take out alone in 2 years. I hadn't meant to say that last part out loud. Frank, who'd known Ellie almost as long as he'd known me, didn't fill the silence with anything easy. He just said quietly, "She'd tell you it's time, Walt," and hung up to go fix what needed fixing. I sat at my kitchen table a while longer, with Ellie's letter still folded in my shirt pocket, the paper gone soft at the creases the way old paper does, and I thought about what it meant that I hadn't told anyone. Not Claire, not even Frank until just now. How long it had been since I'd been able to turn that ignition key on my own boat without my hand shaking. 33 years I'd spent telling other people the truth about what was seaworthy and what wasn't. And here I was, 63 years old, unable to be honest with myself about the exact same question. 2 days later, I drove down to the marina anyway, not to take Ellie's Grace out, just to sit on her, the way you sit with an old friend who doesn't need you to talk. I brought a thermos of coffee and Ellie's letter, still folded, still in my pocket, like something I was carrying to remind myself of what I was protecting. I hadn't been sitting there 20 minutes when I heard small feet on the dock planking, quick and uneven the way 7-year-old feet always are, and looked up to see Mateo Alvarez, my neighbor's grandson, standing at the edge of my slip in a life jacket 2 sizes too big, the way his grandmother always made him wear one, even to walk out on a dock that was barely 4 feet above still water. "Mr. Walt," he said, "are you sad again?" Kids ask you the question adults have spent months tiptoeing around, and they ask it like it's the most natural thing in the world, because to them it is. "A little," I said. "Somebody tried to take something of mine that isn't theirs to take." Mateo considered this with the gravity only a 7-year-old can bring to a genuinely simple question. "Is it stealing if it's family, though? My cousin took my bike and my mom said it's not stealing because we're family." I looked at him for a long moment. "I think," I said slowly, "that people sometimes use the word family to make taking something feel like it isn't taking at all. But a bike's still a bike whether your cousin took it or a stranger did. Same rules." He nodded like that settled something important, then asked if he could see the heron that lived on Piling 7, and just like that we were done talking about theft, and we're back to important things like whether herons had names. But I sat there a long time after his grandmother called him in for dinner, turning that over. A bike's still a bike. A boat's still a boat. Family doesn't change the deed. The escalation started the following week, and once it started, it didn't stop. I know because I watched the notification count climb on my phone screen the way you watch a storm system on radar, a small dark cluster becoming something with a name. Day 1. Claire, 3 missed calls, 1 voicemail. Dad, call me. Diane's really upset. Apparently the reservations office called and said there's some issue with the transfer. Day 2. Claire, 5 missed calls. Dad, please. Diane's saying you're being petty about this. Can we just talk? Day 2. Also, Diane, a text I only glanced at. Walt, I think there's been a misunderstanding at the Meridian office. They're saying something about ownership paperwork. Can you call and clear this up? It's very embarrassing for me and Richard. Day 3. Richard Kessler, a number I didn't recognize, a voicemail I listened to standing in my driveway. His voice was smoother than Diane's, practiced in the particular way of a man used to closing rooms full of skeptical people. Walt, I think there's been a real mix-up here, and I'd love to sort it out, man to man before this becomes a bigger thing than it needs to be. Diane mentioned you're some kind of investor in the boat company, which, frankly, I didn't realize. And if that's true, I think we can work something out that benefits everybody. Give me a call. I didn't call him back, not because I was avoiding him, because I already knew, with the particular certainty you get from 33 years of reading people's boats, and it turns out people themselves, that work something out that benefits everybody from a man I'd never met was not a phrase that ends well for the person who actually owns the thing in question. By day 4, the count on Claire's calls had reached 11, and the text previews had started to shift in tone the way weather shifts before it turns. Dad, call me when you can. Then, Dad, Diane's talking about lawyers. I don't think she means it, but please just call. Then, on the evening of day 4, one that made me sit down at the kitchen table before I finished reading it. Dad, I need you to know I didn't mean for this to get so big. I told her the wrong thing and now I don't know how to fix it, and I'm scared it's going to blow up the wedding before it even starts. I read that one 3 times. Then I looked out the window at the last of the light going purple over the water, and I thought about what Ellie would say, because I always think about what Ellie would say when I'm deciding between the version of myself that reacts and the version that waits. She'd say, Walt, you can be right and still be cruel about how you prove it. Choose the second one, not the first. So I called Claire. She picked up before the first ring finished. Dad, oh my God, finally, I'm here, I said. I'm not upset with you. I need you to hear that first. A long breath on the other end, something between relief and the beginning of tears. I told her the wrong thing. I told Diane you basically didn't need the trip, that it was just a formality. And I said it because she kept asking and asking. And Richard kept talking about how important the ceremony was to him, and I just wanted everyone to be happy at once. And I didn't think about what I was actually giving away because I didn't understand it. I didn't know you owned part of the boat, Dad. Why didn't you ever tell me that? Because your mother and I never wanted it to be a thing anybody felt entitled to, I said. We wanted it to stay something we did out of love for an old friend, not a family asset people started dividing up at Thanksgiving. I paused. Claire, did you know Diane called the reservations office pretending to have my authorization? Silence. Then quietly, I knew she was going to call them. I didn't know she was going to say it was already settled. That's called misrepresentation. Sweetheart, and normally I'd let it go as somebody being pushy, but she also told Frank's office I'd agreed to it, which I never did. And now Richard's leaving me voicemails about working something out, which tells me this was never really about a boat trip in the first place. What do you mean? I told her, then, what Frank had mentioned in an email he'd sent that morning, almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail that becomes enormous, only in hindsight. Richard Kessler ran a boutique real estate investment firm, and he'd recently been courting 2 out-of-state partners for a coastal development deal that hinged, in part, on convincing them he had access to exactly the kind of exclusive small ship yacht world their target buyers wanted to be sold on. A 25th anniversary vow renewal aboard a boutique expedition yacht, photographed and shared with exactly the right people, wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a marketing asset. Diane, I suspected, though I didn't say it to Claire yet, because I wasn't certain enough to say it out loud, might not have fully understood that either. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Dad, I don't think Diane knows that's what it's for. I think she really believes this is about them, about her and Richard. Maybe, I said. That's between the 2 of them. What's between you and me is that I need you to stop trying to manage this by giving away things that aren't yours to give, even with the best intentions in the world. Can you do that? Yes, she said, and her voice cracked on the word in a way that told me she meant it. I'm sorry, Dad, I really am. I know, I said, we're going to be okay. We're always okay. But I need to go handle something now, and I need you to let me handle it without stepping in front of it again. She agreed, and we hung up, and I sat there at the kitchen table with the phone warm in my hand, looking at the manila folder Ellie had labeled almost 30 years ago, still open on the table beside me. Keep forever, she'd written. I thought about how right she'd been to write it, and how wrong Diane Kessler was about to discover herself to be. The following Monday, I drove to Boston. Not because I needed to. Frank had already told me the transfer had been reversed, the reservations office corrected, my name restored as the suite holder of record. But because there's a difference between a problem being fixed on paper and a man needing to stand in a place and look at it with his own eyes, before he believes it's really his again. Frank met me at the gangway in his work jacket, older than I remembered, grayer, but with the same handshake he'd had in 1994. "Come see something," he said, and walked me down into the companionway, past the galley, to the small brass plaque bolted to the bulkhead exactly where I'd left it in my memory. 2 sets of initials, WB and EB, engraved the week the Meridian Star was launched, the metal gone warm and slightly dulled with 2 decades of hands brushing past it in the narrow passage. Frank had polished it. I could tell. It caught the light in a way it hadn't in years. I had Sandra print out the actual documentation, Frank said, handing me a folder. Federal vessel registration, ownership schedule, the whole thing, current as of this morning. Figured you might want it on hand, given the company you're apparently keeping these days. There was no judgment in it, just the dry humor of an old friend who'd watched me get run over by circumstance and wanted to hand me something solid to stand on. I took the folder and didn't open it right there. I didn't need to. I'd spent 33 years reading documents like that one, and I already knew what it said, the same thing it had said since 1994. My name. Right there next to Frank's, and next to a version of Ellie's name that would always be part of that vessel, whether anyone in Diane Kessler's family understood that or not. That evening, back home, I did something I hadn't planned to do, but that felt necessary once the idea arrived. I called Richard Kessler back. He picked up fast, the eagerness of a man who'd been waiting. "Walt, great to hear from you. Listen, I think if we—" "Richard," I said, keeping my voice level, the flat kind. "I want to be very clear with you one time, so we don't have to have this conversation again. I am a documented owner of record on that vessel. I did not authorize any transfer of my suite, and I did not agree to work anything out that benefits everybody because I don't know you, and the one interaction I've had with your family so far involved your fiancé misrepresenting my consent to a business I've had a financial stake in for over 30 years. I don't think this is about an anniversary. I think it's about photographs for your investors. I could be wrong, but I'd think very carefully before you call me again, pretending it's about anything else." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I almost thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, some of the smoothness had gone out of his voice, replaced by something more careful. I don't know where you're getting that impression, Walt. I get a lot of my impressions from documents, Richard. It's what I did for a living for 33 years. I'm usually right. I let that sit for a moment. The wedding's in 6 weeks. I intend to be there for my daughter. I intend to be civil. I do not intend to give up anything else that belongs to me, and I'd encourage you to be very careful about what you promise other people on my behalf going forward. I hung up before he could answer, and I sat in the quiet of my kitchen for a long time afterward, the folder from Frank open on the table in front of me, the brass plaque still bright in my memory, Ellie's letter still folded in my shirt pocket where I'd been carrying it for over a week now, like a second heartbeat. I didn't know it yet, but Richard Kessler was about to make a mistake that would matter far more than anything Diane had done. And it was going to happen in front of every single person we both loved, on the one day none of us could afford for it to happen. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday in November, held at a converted boathouse on the Severn River that Diane had chosen specifically, I'd later learn, because its dock could accommodate a photographer's drone, shot wide enough to capture the water, the string lights, and, if things had gone the way Richard intended, the Meridian Star tied up at the end of the pier as a backdrop for exactly the kind of photograph that ends up in an investment prospectus disguised as a wedding album. I only pieced that part together afterward. At the time, all I knew was that 6 weeks had passed since my phone call with Richard, and in those 6 weeks, the surface of things had gone eerily calm. Claire and I talked more in those 6 weeks than we had in the 6 months before them. She drove down most Sundays, and we sat on Ellie's Grace's back deck, not going anywhere, just sitting the way Ellie and I used to. I told Claire things I hadn't told her before. About the money for her degree, about the drives to the hospital, about the hand that wouldn't turn the ignition key. She cried the first time I told her that last part, and I let her, because some tears are the kind that clear something out rather than adding to the flood, and this was one of those. I also told her, finally, all of it, about the letter Ellie had written in 1994, and the line at the bottom about people who only show up when there's something worth taking. Claire went very quiet, reading it on my phone, then handed it back and said, "I don't want to be one of those people, Dad. I got scared and I let myself become one for about 2 weeks, and I hate that." "You're not one," I told her. "You're someone who made a mistake trying to keep the peace with people who don't actually want peace. They want compliance. Those aren't the same thing. And it took your mother writing it down 30 years ago for me to be able to say that to you clearly. Learn it now instead of waiting 30 years like I did." That was the moment. Sitting on the back deck of a boat I still hadn't managed to take out alone, that I understood something about myself I hadn't wanted to look at directly before. I had spent 2 years being patient with my own grief in a way that had quietly taught Claire that patience meant silence, that loving someone meant absorbing what they took from you without ever naming it. I'd modeled avoidance for her without meaning to, and she'd nearly modeled it right back at me with Diane. "I think I did that to you," I said out loud, surprising myself. "I think I taught you to go quiet instead of push back, because that's what I did with my own grief for 2 years. I'm sorry for that." Claire didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on top of mine, the one that still shook sometimes near that ignition key. And she didn't let go for a long time. Deanne, for her part, sent one more message during those 6 weeks, a single text, the kind you can tell someone spent real time composing. "Walt, I think we got off on the wrong foot, and I hope in time we can move past it as family." I read it twice, typed back 4 words, "I hope so too," and left it there because I'd learned by then that some doors you leave unlocked without necessarily walking back through them. What I didn't know, what none of us knew until the week before the wedding, was that Richard had never actually let go of the idea of using the Meridian Star. He'd simply stopped asking me directly and started asking Frank's newer staff instead, working the edges the way men like Richard always do, testing which doors might still be unlocked, even after the front one had been closed on him. 10 days before the wedding, he called Frank's Boston office directly, using a different tone this time, more businesslike, less personal, and made what Frank later described to me as an aggressive pitch to charter the Meridian Star for a single evening, not the suite, the whole vessel, for what he called a private client event on the night of November 18th. The wedding date. He didn't mention the wedding. He framed it purely as business, offered a number that made even Frank raise an eyebrow, and pushed hard for a same-week answer. Frank, bless him, called me the moment he hung up with Richard. "Walt, something about this doesn't sit right. He's offering triple our usual charter rate for a single evening, for what he's calling a private client event. No further details. Cash deposit ready to wire today if I say yes." That's not how legitimate charters usually move. I sat with that for a moment. "Frank, can you find out anything else before you answer him?" "Nothing invasive. Just ask around." It didn't take much asking. Frank's dockmaster in Boston, a sharp young woman named Priya who ran the marina's slip logs and had, over the years, become the kind of person everyone forgets is quietly paying attention to everything, mentioned that she'd fielded 3 separate calls that same week from a photographer's assistant asking about drone permissions for an investor showcase event tentatively scheduled the same night, same location. She hadn't thought much of it until Frank asked. She forwarded the emails to him without being asked twice, the way people do when something's been nagging at them, and they're relieved somebody finally gave them a reason to say it out loud. I want to be clear about how that evidence came to me because it matters. Nobody hacked an account. Nobody went digging where they had no business going. A dockmaster who'd noticed something odd handed over emails she'd received directly in the ordinary course of her own job, the same way any employee might flag something that didn't sit right. That's the only kind of proof I've ever trusted. and it's the only kind I was willing to use. Frank forwarded the whole thread to me that same evening. Reading it at my kitchen table, the picture assembled itself with an ugly kind of clarity. Richard's investment firm was closing a coastal development deal that hinged on convincing two out-of-state partners that his firm ran in exclusive old-money maritime circles. He needed photographs. He needed the Meridian Star, specifically because he'd already shown his partners preliminary marketing images that referenced it by name, images he had no right to have used in the first place, apparently lifted from the company's own promotional materials, months earlier, when Diane, thinking she was helping, had forwarded him some brochures Frank's office had sent for the anniversary planning. The wedding, the vow renewal that Diane believed was about reconciliation and love, had become, somewhere in Richard's calculations, a convenient occasion to stage the exact kind of evening his investors needed to see, whether the boat was legitimately his to use or not. I sat there a long time with that thread open on my laptop screen, and I thought about the brass plaque with two sets of initials, and Ellie's handwriting about people who show up when there's something worth taking, and I thought, for the first time since this whole thing started, not about Diane at all, but about Diane's own daughter-in-law to be discovering this the same way Claire had, that someone she loved had used her desire for reconciliation as a tool to get somewhere else entirely. I didn't know it yet, but Diane was about to learn that lesson in the worst possible place, in front of everyone, on what should have been the best night of her second chance at a marriage. I called Frank back the next morning. "Denny the charter," I said, formally, in writing, citing unauthorized use of the vessel's name and likeness in third-party marketing materials without company consent. "And Frank, I want to be there on the 18th, not to make a scene. I have a right to be at my own daughter's wedding regardless of any of this, and I intend to exercise it." "You're not planning something dramatic, are you, Walt?" Frank asked, and I could hear the smile in it, the particular tone of a man who'd known me long enough to trust exactly how far I would and wouldn't go. "I'm planning to bring a folder," I said. "That's all. The rest depends entirely on what Richard does when he doesn't get what he came for. I want to pause here and tell you something about what the 18th actually was, before I tell you what happened on it, because the shape of the day matters as much as anything that occurred within it. Diane and Richard weren't simply renewing vows after a quiet separation. They'd divorced 11 years earlier, badly, after Richard's first business had collapsed and taken most of their savings with it, and Diane had spent most of the years since rebuilding a life and a self-respect she'd nearly lost in that collapse. Getting back together with Richard, for her, wasn't casual. It was, in her mind, proof that the years of rebuilding had led somewhere, that she'd been right to give a broken man a second chance because people can change. I didn't know all of this yet on the morning of the 18th. I learned it later, mostly from Claire, mostly after everything had already happened, and it reframed the whole evening for me in a way I want you to carry forward. Because Diane Kessler, whatever else she was not simply a villain in this story. She was a woman who wanted so badly to believe in a particular kind of redemption that she never once stopped to ask whether the man asking for it had actually earned it, or whether he was simply very good at making people believe he had. That distinction was about to become the entire evening. The boathouse was lit exactly the way Diane had planned it. Strings of warm bulbs looped along the rafters, the river dark and silver beyond the open doors. Round tables set with white linens and small hurricane candles that flickered every time the door opened to let in the cold November air. Claire looked beautiful, radiant in the particular way brides look when the day has finally arrived after months of planning, and she found me at the edge of the room before the ceremony started, squeezed my hand, and said, "Whatever happens tonight, Dad, I'm glad you're here." I told her the same thing I'd told her weeks earlier. We're always okay. The vow renewal itself went smoothly. Diane and Richard stood at the front of the boathouse under an arch of white roses, and Richard gave a speech about second chances that made several people in the audience reach for tissues, and I sat in my seat with the folder Frank had given me resting closed on my lap. And I watched Diane's face while Richard spoke, and I thought, watching her, that whatever else was true about this night, she believed every word coming out of his mouth. That was the part that made everything after it harder than I expected. The trouble started during the reception, a little after 9, when a photographer I didn't recognize, not the one Diane and Claire had hired months earlier, but a second one, younger, carrying a different kind of camera bag, walked in through the side entrance near the dock and began setting up lighting equipment on the pier itself, angled out toward the water where the Meridian Star should have been tied up and wasn't, because Frank had denied the charter 11 days earlier, exactly as I'd asked him to. I watched the photographer look at the empty slip, then pull out his phone, then walk quickly across the room to find Richard at the head table. I didn't hear what was said. I didn't need to. I watched Richard's face change color in the string lights, watched him lean down and say something low and urgent to Diane, watched Diane's expression shift from confusion to something sharper, something that made her stand up from the table entirely, napkin still in her lap, falling to the floor unnoticed. "Where is the boat, Richard?" Her voice carried further than she probably intended, cutting cleanly through the low hum of the reception. A few nearby conversations stopped. "You told me it would be here. You told my son it would be here for the photos." Richard's answer came too fast, too smooth, the practiced tone of a man used to talking his way out of rooms. "There was a scheduling issue with the marina, babe. I'm handling it. It's not a big... Don't call me babe right now." Diane's voice had gone very still, very cold, and I recognized that particular register, because it was close enough to my own flat voice that I understood exactly what it meant. She was 3 steps past angry and standing somewhere colder. "You told me the marina confirmed. You told my son you'd secured it for tonight specifically. Why would you need it for tonight specifically, Richard, when our ceremony's happening right here?" I didn't know it yet, standing there with the folder still closed on my lap. But the next 30 seconds were going to be the ones that mattered most in this entire story, more than anything I'd done with paperwork or ownership documents, because what came next didn't come from me at all. Diane didn't get an answer from Richard before Jordan was on his feet. He'd been sitting 3 tables over with Claire, still in the gray suit he'd worn to stand up as her groom 2 hours earlier, and he crossed the space between them fast. The way you move when you've spent years watching a pattern from a distance and finally see it complete itself in front of everyone at once. "Dad." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the particular carrying that comes from a room already gone quiet around a fight. "Tell her the truth. Right now. Tell her why you needed that boat tonight specifically." Richard's jaw worked for a second before anything came out of it. "Jordan, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time." Jordan didn't look at his father when he said it. He looked at his mother. "Mom, I found out 3 days ago that Dad's been telling his investors he'd fixed the whole coastal deal with a yacht showcase for weeks. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to ruin your night. And I've hated myself for it every single day since, but I'm not doing it anymore. He needed that boat here tonight because 2 men flying in from Charlotte are supposed to see photos of you 2 on it tomorrow morning." In an email his assistant already drafted. "This was never about you getting married again. It's about him closing a deal." The room had gone fully silent now, the kind of silence with a shape to it, the string lights humming faintly overhead. Somebody's chair scraping once against the floor and then stopping. Deanne looked at Richard for what felt like a very long time. I watched her face do something I recognized, because I'd felt the same thing standing in her kitchen doorway 6 weeks earlier, holding a casserole dish, hearing myself called pathetic by someone who thought I couldn't hear. It's the particular look of a person realizing, all at once, that the story they'd been telling themselves about being chosen was actually a story about being useful. "Is that true?" she asked him. Not loud, almost gentle. The way you ask a question you already know the answer to but need to hear confirmed out loud anyway. Richard opened his mouth, and whatever came out, I never learned exactly what, because Diane didn't wait to hear it. She picked her napkin up off the floor, folded it once, set it on the table with a precision that somehow said more than shouting would have, and walked to the small stage where the band had gone quiet along with everyone else. I want to apologize to my son and his fiancée, she said, and her voice shook only slightly, for letting tonight become about something it should never have been about. And I want to apologize to Walt Bishop, who I called pathetic in my own kitchen 6 weeks ago, a comment I never intended for him to hear and have regretted every day since I learned that he had. She looked out at the room, found me at my table. You didn't deserve that, Walt. None of what happened after it either. I hadn't planned on standing up. I stood up anyway. The folder was still in my hand, still closed, and I want to tell you that I never opened it that night, because I'd decided weeks earlier, sitting at my kitchen table with Frank's documents in front of me, that whatever proof I carried into that room, I would only use it if I had to, and only ever in private, one person at a time, the way you'd want someone to handle something true and damaging about you if the roles were reversed. Diane had just done the hardest part of the work herself, out loud, in front of everyone she loved. There was nothing left in that folder that needed saying to a room. Thank you, I said, and that was all. Then I looked at Claire, who was crying quietly at her table with Jordan's hand wrapped around hers, and I sat back down, and the band, after a moment of not knowing what else to do, started playing again, softer than before, and the evening found its way back to something resembling itself. Richard left 20 minutes later. Nobody stopped him. I heard later from Claire that he tried calling Diane 4 times over the following week, and she didn't answer any of them, and that the coastal development deal fell through entirely 2 months after that, though I couldn't tell you whether that was cause or coincidence, and I've decided I don't need to know. Frank found me by the bar a little after 10, still in his good coat, having driven down from Boston that morning at my invitation, not to make a scene, exactly as I'd told him, but because I'd wanted one person in that room who'd known Ellie, who'd know what it meant if the night went sideways, and I needed somebody steady nearby. He didn't say much. He put a hand on my shoulder, the same hand that had shaken mine on a gangway 22 years earlier, when the Meridian Star was still just a hull in a shipyard, and he said, "She'd have been proud of how you handled that, Walt. All of it." I didn't trust my voice enough to answer him. I just nodded, and he nodded back, and that was enough between 2 old sailors who'd never needed many words for the things that mattered most. Diane found me near the coat check as the reception wound down, Claire's borrowed shawl over her shoulders against the November cold coming off the river. "I owe you a longer conversation than tonight allows," she said, "but I wanted to say it properly, in person. I let my own hope for something get twisted into taking from someone who never did anything to deserve it. I'm sorry, Walt. Truly. I know what wanting something to be real feels like," I said. "I spent 2 years wanting my wife back badly enough that I couldn't turn the key on our own boat. I understand hope making people careless with the truth more than you might think." I paused. "I'd like to sit down with you and Frank sometime next week at the Marina office, just to put in writing that there's no ongoing claim on your end to the vessel or the company, nothing complicated, just an acknowledgement that clears the record for everybody, not as a punishment, just so nobody has to wonder again." She agreed without hesitation, and the following Tuesday she came to Frank's Boston office and signed a simple document Frank's attorney had drawn up, an acknowledgement that she had received full notice of the ownership structure of the Meridian Star and the company that operated it, and an agreement not to pursue any further claim to access, use, or benefit from the vessel going forward. Nothing about inheritance, because there had never been any inheritance to speak of, only a confusion of entitlement that needed, finally, a plain and honest correction on paper. She read it twice before signing, the way a person reads something they want to fully understand rather than simply escape, and when she set the pen down, she looked at the brass plaque on the bulkhead behind Frank's desk for a long moment. 2 names, she said. That's a good thing to build something on. 2, and only the 2 who actually put something in. I told her I thought so too. There's one more thing I need to tell you before I close this out, because it's the part that mattered most to me, more than any signature or any apology given in a marina office. 2 weeks after the wedding, on a cold, clear Saturday in early December, I drove down to Ellie's Grace alone, the way I had 100 times over the previous 2 years without ever once taking her out past the breakwater. Claire came with me that day, though, without my asking, just showed up on the dock in her father's old wool coat with 2 thermoses of coffee and said, "I thought you might want company for this one." I didn't ask her how she knew what that particular Saturday was going to be. I think mothers and daughters carry certain knowledge between them without needing it spoken, and I think, somehow, Claire had inherited that from Ellie the same way she'd inherited her mother's habit of sketching the coastline badly and lovingly from the rail. I stood at the helm, and my hand found the ignition key, and it shook, the way it always had. Claire didn't say anything. She just stood beside me, close enough that her shoulder touched mine, and waited. The way you wait for someone you love to find their own way through something, rather than pulling them through it. I thought about Ellie's letter, still folded in my shirt pocket where I'd carried it for 2 months by then, about a boat staying something built on love, rather than something people felt entitled to take. I thought about Matteo asking me if it was stealing when family does it. I thought about the brass plaque, 2 sets of initials, warm under 22 years of hands, and I turned the key. The engine caught on the first try, the way it always used to, the way it was always going to, because there had never actually been anything wrong with the engine at all. I looked over at Claire, and she was crying and smiling at the same time, and I pulled her into a hug right there in the cockpit, the first real hug either of us had given the other in longer than either of us wanted to admit. 2 people who'd spent 2 years being careful and quiet with each other's grief instead of simply holding on to one another through it. I should have taken you sailing with me a long time ago, instead of waiting until I could do it perfectly. I told her, my voice not entirely steady. That was my mistake more than anyone else's in this whole thing. I taught you to wait quietly for permission instead of asking for what you needed, because that's what I was doing with my own grief. I'm sorry for that. You're doing it now, she said into my shoulder. That's what matters. We took Ellie's Grace out past the breakwater that morning, just the 2 of us, the water flat and silver under a low winter sun. And I didn't say much, because there wasn't much that needed saying. Some things you just do, quietly, the way you finally prove something to yourself that no amount of talking ever could. The following September, I flew to Boston and boarded the Meridian Star for the 12th time, the owner's suite exactly where it had always been, my name exactly where it had always been printed on the documents in Frank's drawer. Claire came this time, her first trip aboard, sketchbook in hand, badly imitating her mother's old habit of drawing the coastline from the rail the way I'd tried to do myself and mostly failed at over the years. Frank stood at the helm as we cleared the harbor, same as he had for 2 decades, and somewhere off Grand Manan Island, in the kind of fog Ellie always said looked like something out of a dream. Claire and I stood at the rail together and let her ashes go into the water, and I said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud after everything. Nobody gets to decide what's yours except the people who actually built it with you. Everybody else just gets to ask. I'm Walt Bishop. I'm 63 years old, and I didn't shout, and I didn't threaten anybody, and I never once had to raise my voice to remind a single person whose name was on the paperwork. I just called an old friend, told the truth quietly, and let the truth do the rest of the work on its own. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe, so you never miss what happens the next time somebody forgets exactly whose name is on the deed.